He wants me to spend my money, is what it is. I'll spend my money for you. There's still plenty of time left for the next set, so I'll get a wild card for you. The banana, we'll get the banana for you.
It was. I subsequently learned that she had got past the porter with a statement that her mother had sent with her a message of vital urgency, and with other inducement. "I've got away again, sweet lover of mine," she said, as I took her in my arms. "Mother is mad, I think. Hide me, and take me away with you. Marry me or not, I don't care. I love you and want you so frightfully that I could kill anyone who stood between us." What was I to do? I wanted her just as badly as she wanted me. She wanted to be loved, had, there and then, but I, with that practical good sense which I flatter myself distinguishes me, made coffee and toast and an omelet, and made her eat with me. Then we stole down and got past the heavily bribed porter. Remember, term was over, and he was once more a human being, and I no longer a professor. Reached the garage, carrying my bags, which were already packed, got out the car, and made a beeline for London, where we put up at a quiet West Central hotel. Next day I visited my co-trustee early, whilst Unica went shopping. She had, of course, come away wholly unprovided with any sort of trousseau. I confided the facts and outline to my co-trustee, who was horribly shocked, got a special license at Doctors' Commons, and in the shortest possible time we were married at a registry and fled. Yes, we absolutely fled to Paris. From Paris, we both wrote to Mrs. Clayton, announcing the inevitable, irredeemable event. But we gave her no address, merely saying that we should be away for at least 3 months, and would send an address for her to write to and forgive us. The only person to whom I confided my whereabouts was the horrified lawyer. I could, in normal circumstances, take a vivid pleasure in recalling and recording the amazement and delight of the most wonderful honeymoon that was ever granted to mortal man. Unica, who, to my surprise, I found had never been further from her home than Cosmopoli, was delighted, not childishly, but wonderingly, with everything she saw. The beauty of nature, of art, of architecture, of antiquity, filled her with deep happiness, which, oddly enough, was merged with her in a deep sensual enjoyment of life. Keenly intelligent and interested in everything she saw, whenever she found herself in surroundings of exceptional beauty, a thrill of passion would come over her which rapidly communicated itself to me. And the wayside scenery of La Vendée and the Bocage, the ruins of departed civilization, 100 spots in western and southern France where we stopped the car to roam at will, come back to my mind as scenes beautified to memory by the most exquisite physical delights. The natural disturbance of her system in which we made our flight from Cosmopoli seemed to ripen her physical and mental faculties to the highest point. But whenever this was past, she displayed a power of response to emotional stimuli which I sometimes almost fear would wear her out. But we were determined not to climb mountains until we reached them, and lived long days and marvelous nights, unimagined by the most poetic and fantastic dreamers of the East. It was at Avignon one morning as she was lying in my arms watching the sun rise through our open window that she said with her lips on mine, "Rex, we are going to have a child." It needed but that to complete our happiness, though from that moment the joy we had in one another became more reasonable, perhaps a little less passionate. I could always rouse her to an ecstasy of desire by caressing and playing with the wonderful masses of hair under her arms, and her desire appeased, could always soothe her to sleep by the same means. But her passion for me as a male had to some extent given place in her to a fierce maternity. As soon as she knew that she was pregnant, she never had any doubt about it, she wrote announcing her news to her mother, and we anxiously awaited her reply, for we felt that this would put the finishing touch to her mother's forgiveness and reconcile her to the marriage she had so strenuously opposed. A week passed by, and then I received a telegram from my co-trustee. It said, "Mrs. Clayton has died suddenly under distressing circumstances. Please return at once." I was horrified and wondered how I should break the news to Unica. We were sitting in the palace of the Caesars, quite alone that afternoon, and I thought it a good opportunity. I began, "Darling, I've had bad news today." "Have we got to go back? I shan't mind much. I've got my baby." She always talked of it as if it were already born. "No, darling," I replied. "It's about your mother." She looked at me quite gravely and said, "Is she dead?" I could not help feeling a little shocked. She might have been asking if lunch was ready. I began, "You must not take it too much to heart. You've got me. And I've got my baby. What does anything else matter? When do we go home?" I was chilled, but in the circumstances it was better that she should take it like this than that she should suffer paroxysms of grief. She accepted the situation quite calmly. When I told her that she should now have 600 pounds a year of her own, she said, "I shall not have to spend any of it, shall I? You are quite rich. I shall save it all for my baby." She never said "our baby." Then she said, "Do you think Professor Barrowdale was my father?" This was a blow between the eyes, and I said rather lamely, "Well, I have often wondered about it myself, but he never told me anything about it. Did your mother never say anything about your father?" I was curious that we had never touched upon this subject before. "No," she answered. "I never asked her but once, and then she seemed dreadfully upset, and said I must never speak to her about my father. She could not bear to think about it." After a pause, she added, "I don't think Professor Barrowdale was my father. I never felt like it, and I don't think I should have. If he seemed more interested in me, and how I got on with lessons and things, and how I was growing up, than really fond of me. Sometimes I fancied that he disliked me, that I repugned him." One of her words. "But anyhow, he must have been an awfully good man. See how he looked after us?" "He was a good man," I answered stoutly. "No one ever knew what a lot of fine things he did, especially for women, the sort of women you have never heard of, women who had come to grief and were down and out." "Do you mean prostitutes?" I was ceasing to be amazed at my wife's sudden remarks, which from time to time showed an esoteric knowledge of the world. Gathered I am at a loss to know how or whence. "Well," I said, "that is about it." "I don't wonder he was so good to them. It seems awful for men to be so down upon girls who are what I should have been, and proud of it if you hadn't married me. After all, they are responsible, aren't they?" "Perhaps." "And yet, I don't know. I wanted you so frightfully the moment I saw you that you could not have helped having me. No one can say you seduced me." And thereupon this amazing girl turned to other subjects as if this had been an ordinary dinner-party conversation. But I never loved her more than I did then, or, for that matter, more than I do now. In truth, I could reply when, as she often did, she asked me, "How much do you love me, Rex?" A little more than I did yesterday, but not so much as I shall tomorrow. And then by a 3 days' journey, for I was anxious in the circumstances that she should travel easily, we came back to London, and the world crashed into ruins around me, and the light went out of my life forever. Ich hab geliebt und gelebt. We arrived one evening of the late summer, and put up at the same hotel as that which sheltered us when we fled from Cosmopoli. And next morning I called upon my co-trustee, who received me with grave and forbidding formality. It was clear from his manner that he regarded me as a perverter of youth, and incidentally as a murderer. I tried to open the conversation upon conventional lines. "This is a most unfortunate circumstance," I began. He interrupted me. "It is more than unfortunate, it is deeply tragic." "You mean Professor Magley," he replied. "It is not my duty, nor have I the inclination, to sit in judgment upon your actions, or even to express an opinion. Of course, I hold an opinion which I should be loath to express. I will confine myself to the facts. When you eloped, is, I believe, the technical expression, with Mrs. Clayton's daughter, she came up to town and saw me. She was quite dazed, stunned by what she termed the catastrophe. I will admit that she seemed to regard your action with a horror which, bad as it was, appeared to me exaggerated, seeing that you had repaired your fault, as far as it could be repaired by rapid marriage. She bitterly blames herself for having so far relaxed her vigilance as to make the meeting between yourself and our ward possible. But the extraordinary, if I may say so, the indecent rapidity with which these events took place made it impossible for her to do her duty as she expressed it. What may have been that duty and what the views entertained by herself and by the late Professor Barrowdale as to her daughter's future may be, I cannot conjecture, nor did she enlighten me. But I gathered that she had solemnly sworn to prevent her daughter's marriage if it were possible, by the revelation of certain facts known only to herself and the late professor.
Cheetah girl?
Of what these may have been, I have no idea, but I gather that they are contained in a written statement which it becomes my duty to deliver to you. I saw her no more after this interview, but I went down to Cosmopoli to see after her affairs, and to attend the inquest. The inquest? Yes. You have not seen the papers this morning? No. I arrived last night, and came straight here this morning. It took place yesterday, and her remains were buried in the parish churchyard yesterday afternoon. It was her wish that neither you nor her daughter should see her again. She was right. It was no sight for a young woman who expects to become a mother. Then you know. Yes, one moment. I learned from her servant that on a receipt of a letter from our ward in which she announced her condition, Miss Clayton spent 2 days without moving from her chair, refusing to eat or to see such neighbors as she had admitted to a slight acquaintance. On the morning of the 3rd day, the servant, entering the sitting-room, which this unhappy lady had not left, found her lying upon the divan, which was soaked in her blood. She had cut her throat, inexpertly, with a common penknife. She must have bled slowly to death. The windpipe was not severed, and the jugular vein only just sufficiently wounded to allow the blood to escape, comparatively slowly. She had left a letter for me, which you had better read. He handed me a sheet of paper scrawled over with incoherent sentences. It said, I cannot face it. I am a coward. I knew I should be when the time came. I ought to have, but I had no chance. I'm going to kill myself. I cannot face Unica. She must never know. I promised Paul B. that when a man wanted to marry her, I would give him the papers. I had no time. If I had had time, I know I could not. Mr. Magley must see them. No one else, not even you. You have them, the packet I gave you when Paul B. died. He will understand. What he will do, I forgive him. It wasn't his fault. It was my fault. He will understand when he reads. God help him and her. It must not be. Ursula Clayton. What does it mean? I asked in a voice which I hardly recognized as my own. I do not know. But, Professor Magley, I own that I am terrified, and that I am deeply sorry for you. Paul Barrowdale was a strange man. There were episodes in his earlier life that no one knew about, and what I could guess from collateral evidence and on occasional hint which he dropped appalled me, hardened as I am by a long professional career to the wilder aberrations of the human mind. Not that Paul Barrowdale was mentally affected. No one was ever more sane, but he indulged in what seemed to me to be terrible and morbid curiosities. Though my views as to your conduct remain unaltered, believe me, I am deeply sorry for you. I fear that the punishment of your crime, I put it as high as that, may be almost more than any human being should be called upon to bear. Mind, I know nothing. I can only guess, and my brain reels when I allow myself to wander into conjecture. I will now give you the packet of papers to which Mrs. Clayton refers in her letter. I had some difficulty in keeping them from the corridor on the grounds of professional confidence, and that the papers were not hers but Marigold's, and consequently the property of yourself and me as his executors. And with that, the lawyer handed me a large square envelope, sealed at every flap with Paul Barrowdale's private seal. If I may add a word of advice, continued he, I would earnestly beg you not to open this envelope until you and your wife are settled in whatever house you have provided, or will provide, for her. Until that is done, you will require all your presence and concentration of mind. I will not hide from you the fact that these incidents are likely to have a significant influence upon your career and position in the university. My mouth was as dry as a morphinomaniac's. I felt deathly cold to the tips of my fingers and toes. I felt that my world was collapsing and that I was being buried in the wreck and ruin of forces of which I was utterly ignorant. I hardly know how I got back to Unica. Fortunately, she was quite calm and showed no curiosity as to my co-trustee. A few days passed, during which I went down to Cosmopoli and took a small furnished house in the town. and instinctively I engaged the girl who had been in Mrs. Clayton's service to come and attend to us. Whether it was an effect of the nervous tension in which I was living, the sense of impending horror, conscience if you will, I do not know. But it seemed to me as if the few acquaintances whom I met curiously and askant upon me, avoided me rather. My one object now was to get settled and to know the worst.
Excuse me for a second.
I brought Unica down to Cosmopoli, where she took to her new abode like a cat to a new and comfortable basket. She never mentioned her mother. My precautionary warning to the servant not to go into details with the ineradicable gusto of her class was unnecessary.
No thanks. Goodbye.
Unica did not go out at all. She lay most of the day on the divan which I had installed in conformity with which I knew to be her inclination, and did not appear to notice that in these days passion was utterly dead within me. At night she curled up by my side with her arms and legs wound round me as if I had been a sister to her, and slept peacefully whilst I lay awake listening to the university clocks and praying for daylight. I put off the opening of Paul Barrowdale's envelope from day to day. I was afraid. I told myself that I must get my nerves into stable condition before I undertook the perusal of... what? The time came, however, when I pulled myself together and determined to solve the mystery. And one evening, it was about a month ago, when Unica had gone to bed, I broke the seals. I read. And all the time, continuously it seemed to me, the university clocks cut off and flung into the rag-bag of the past, section after section of my life. End of section 9. Section 10 of The Purple Sapphire and Other Posthumous Papers by Christopher Blayre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Cheetah Girl, Part 2. The manuscript of Paul Barrowdale. This must be written. Some day a man may want to marry Unica, and he must know. I am sorry for him, whoever he may be, but he must know. With an introduction setting forth the physiological researches which have led me to the terrible position of affairs here recorded, I will set down the facts in narrative form. The study of the physiological phenomena of gestation and reproduction, and the evolution of genera and species, has occupied my mind almost exclusively during the whole of my career. Closely connected with this question are the remarkable experiments and their results upon the artificial fertilization of parthenogenetic, or, to use Lancaster's preferable, impaternate, eggs, carried out by Jacques Loeb, Bataillon, Deslage, and others. The outcome of their researches has seemed to prove incontestably that the function of the male spermatozoon in the fertilization of the female ovum is, in the first place, purely mechanical. They have fertilized and brought up to a pronounced stage of development the larvae, and even to relative maturity, parthenogenetic, impaternate, eggs of echinoderms and batrachians, by means of artificial stimuli, such as hypertonic solutions, pricking with a fine needle, brushing with camel hair brushes, to cite in a generalized form only a few of the methods employed in the laboratories of science. Those who would know more of this are referred to the many papers published on the subject in scientific journals, and of late in the textbooks. We start, therefore, from the conclusion that the action of the spermatozoon is primarily mechanical. It merely perforates and excites the ovum and sets it going, so to speak, and may therefore be replaced by artificial and mechanical means. This being so, we may turn to the theory which deeply occupied the mind of Alphonse Milne Edwards during the later years of his life. The question arises, why should there be any limits to the possibility of miscegenation? We know that, within a genus, allied species can breed together, as for example a horse with a donkey, a tiger with a jaguar, a fox with a dog. Instances might be largely multiplied. But genera cannot breed with genera, as, for example, a dog with a cat, a horse with a hyena, or an elephant with a rhinoceros. To carry it to the highest point, a man with a mare, a woman with a dog. Why not? If the action of the male spermatozoon is mainly mechanical, why not? This was the problem which occupied the mind of Milne Edwards, and he discussed it with Ray Lancaster shortly before his death. And Lancaster has recorded his impressions of the discussion in one of his later volumes of collected scientific essays. I will transcribe here his account of the matter. He says, he, Milne Edwards, held it to be probable, as many physiologists would agree, that the fertilization of the egg of one species by the sperm of another, even a remotely related one, is ultimately prevented by a chemical incompatibility. Chemical in the sense that the highly complex molecular constitution of such bodies as the antitoxins and serums with which physiologists are beginning to deal is chemical, and that all other and secondary obstacles to fertilization can be overcome or evaded in the course of experiment. He proposed to inject one species with serums extracted from the other, in such a way as seemed most likely to bring the chemical state of their reproductive elements into harmony, that is to say, into a condition in which they should not be actively antagonistic, but admit of fusion and union. He proposed by the exchange of living and highly organized fluids, by means of injection or transfusion between a male and a female of separate species, to assimilate the chemical constitution of one to that of the other, and thus probably so to affect their reproductive elements that the one tolerate and fertilize the other. In this case, observe that the influence of the male spermatozoon would be more than merely mechanical. The male would transmit his physical characteristics to the zygote, the embrothus called into existence. When the sea urchins, echinus eggs, to which I have referred above, are pierced, as is done in laboratory experiments, by the sperm filaments of feather star, Comacula, introduced for the purpose in another series of experiments, the sperm filaments pierce the egg coat but contribute no substance to the embryo into which the egg develops.
It is more than punishment.
They merely stimulate it and set changes going. But if physiological technique could be perfected to such a point as to harmonize the fluids of the feather star with those of the sea urchin, we should, or might, get a hybrid between Comacula and echinus. To adumbrate is at once an ultimate result to be aimed at. How often we find a splendid young woman married to a physically perfect young man, keenly anxious to have babies and carrying out to the full of their privileges towards that end, but they remain childless. It is clear that their serums are toxic to one another. The man has a passing affair with a servant girl or shop assistant, and she immediately has a baby. The woman gives herself sporadically to a lover and immediately conceives. They have found their natural affinity. There is, in my opinion, a great future in store for the bold surgeon or physiologist who will rectify matters in these sterile marriages by bringing the husband and wife into a condition of mutual equilibrium by injection, inoculation, or transfusion, as suggested by Milne Edwards. How is this to be done, and how are the facts to be established? The answer comes to us from the physiologist's laboratory, and from the clinic. How often one reads in the newspapers, and even in novels, of devoted friends who have offered themselves when a comrade is suffering from severe hemorrhage, and in other circumstances, for transfusion of blood. Sometimes we are told that, in spite of the heroism of the friend, the patient has died. In 9 cases out of 10, it is, or was, because of that heroic gift of the friend. The patient has been killed, as surely as if the operating surgeon had blown out his brains. The war hospitals of 1914 to 1918 afforded us first examples, then experiments, and at last lessons, which once learned have abolished the grave danger attending transfusion of blood from one human being to another.
This is great.
It has been established that in this matter the human subject is divided into 4 classes, between which phenomena are varied. If a drop of blood from the donor and recipient are mixed upon a microscope slide, the corpuscles either swim about freely together in the mixed serum, in which case the operation may be safely performed, or hemolysis, agglutination, takes place. The corpuscles clot together. And we know that, if the operation is proceeded with, the recipient will be almost immediately killed. Before the dawn of this knowledge, how many patients may have fallen victims to the heroism of a toxic friend? To make this matter clearer, If you are not already familiar with it, I will reproduce here the diagram from back in Edwards' textbook of surgery, page 79. In the case marked plus, agglutination takes place. In the cases marked O, no agglutination takes place. Thus it will be seen that the blood of group 4 may safely be given to any recipient. They are the universal donors. The serum of group 1 does not agglutinate when mixed with that of any of the others. They are the universal recipients. But give the blood, say, of group 3 to a patient of group 2, you will kill the patient. In the case of the sterile marriages, a simple blood test of this kind will establish the facts upon which the surgeon may safely proceed. You will wonder, whoever you are, who is destined to read this manuscript, why I have delayed my narrative by this long scientific introduction. It is in the nature of an apologia, in the classical sense of the word, for what follows. As a young man and beyond that time, I made many experiments to prove the truth of this theory, many of which were entirely successful. I produced hybrids between widely separated genera, which often shocked even myself. I did not dare to publish my researches to the world. The time was not ripe. The scientific outlook was not yet sufficiently broad. Negligent as I was, almost to the point of fearlessness, of public opinion, I shrank from the howls of ignorant rage which would have greeted the publication of my results. The anti-vivisection mania was at its height. Foul libels upon the earnest works of physiological research found ready publication in the press, and it was tacitly understood among physiologists that our experiments must for the most part be kept to ourselves. University authorities looked ever with an anxious eye upon the biological laboratories, ever anticipating the eruption of some sensational scandal or subversive theory, which would rouse a storm of ill-informed invective against the scientific teachings of the universities. But in my private laboratory, which became a veritable zoological garden, I never relaxed my efforts. You will not be surprised, even though you be shocked at what I am going to say next. I looked forward, as the crowning experiment of my career, to the production of a hybrid between one of the higher forms of the animal world and man. You must realize my position. The sexual union of human beings and animals is, no doubt properly, shuddered at, as perhaps the foulest form of unnatural crime. It figures in our books of jurisprudence under the name of bestiality, a felony punishable until comparatively recent years with death, and actually with penal servitude for life. How could a man in my position put himself into the power of a man who would tend himself to so filthy an experiment? The widely varying forms of sodomy were looked upon as aberrations, but were nonetheless punished by long terms of imprisonment. But bestiality was regarded as an even lower and more revolting form of vice. The accomplice would necessarily be of the lowest order of criminal, and one might have laid himself open to everlasting blackmail. The suggestion is obvious that I might have been an active participator in the experiment. I will only say that my whole soul revolted from the idea with shuddering disgust, and I should, to put it on no higher grounds, have been physically impotent in approaching the subject from a personal point of view. I read the horrible treatise on the subject of Dubois de Salt, published in 1705, and my gorge rose at the long catalogue of horrors he had resuscitated from the morgue of forgotten criminal records. Bestiality as a crime dates from the highest antiquity. In the more outspoken early editions of our Bible it is indicated, howled in certa voce, as rife among the Jews both male and female, and the references to it in Exodus and Leviticus are explicit. In mythology it appears as a common ruse among gods, who appear to have found it easier to seduce the daughters of men metamorphosed as animals than clothed in their normal and godlike attributes. The legends of Phoebus and the lesbian Issa, of Pasiphae, of Leda, of Io, are prominent examples among the metamorphoses of Ovid. In the Middle Ages, the devil is constantly taking the form of a goat for the purposes of sexual connection with reputed witches. The work of Boguet upon the sorcerers, 1607, teems with examples, and gives categoric instances of women who have been fecundated by dogs, whilst the laborious compilation of Dubois de Salt runs to 450 pages of revolting record. The works of Voltaire bristle with instances on record of the resultant birth of the monsters. In India, sculptures on the temples of Shiva, especially at Orissa, represent continually the sexual conjugation of women with apes, dogs, and other animals. The criminal codes of Prussia, Germany, and the United States recognize the crime. That of Pope John XIII provided for its accommodation, but a fine of 250 livres. The historians Aelian and Athenaeus cite numerous instances as a mere matter of record, and as lately as 1882, La Cassagne has produced a work, La criminalité chez les animaux. As active or passive agents, human beings form a long procession down the records of jurisprudence. And the work upon the subject of Tardieu is well known to pathologists, alienists, and jurists. As a rule, the crime was included under the general heading of sodomy, but the earlier jurists drew a sharp distinction, e.g., A. de la Guarie, who gives the definition sodomia, i.e., cum personae e jusdum sexus, e bestialitas, i.e., concubitus cum bestia. Bestiality as a deliberate inclination is classed by Krafft-Ebing with sadism, flagellation, exhibitionism, necrophilia, and homosexuality under the general heading of paresthesia. And the scientific attitude towards these aberrations may be summed up as follows. Too many different factors concur to produce races for it to be possible to unify, to codify human morality. Heredity, climate, education, social conditions, riches or poverty, each of these contributes a different factor. The human creature is not always master of his functions. His existence depends upon inimical or allied factors against which it is sometimes impossible for him to react. Therefore, in the face of the worst turpitudes of human nature, known to us as crime or vice, the scientist does not protest. He merely seeks for the causes and tabulates the effects. Undoubtedly, the dominating factor is heredity, and Tardieu goes even further than this in ascribing such aberrations to atavism. And we find the records of such factors in every corpus of legend and tradition from the golden ass of Apuleius down to the bestialities of the Arabian Nights, from the references of Nicolas de Venette to those of Montaigne and Balzac, of Armand Charpentier, and others. Among savage races we have the amazing records of Paul de Chaillu, dating from comparatively modern times, with loathsome romances of de Musset, Jamiani, bishops, and of other pornographers we have not to concern ourselves. This rapid historic review has seemed to be necessary as an indication of the lines along which this horrible subject may be pursued and studied, should it be required to do so. There have been many cases recorded of bestiality in which women have been the passive human participants. They, in fact, constitute the majority of recorded instances, obviously by reason of the fact that, in such cases, the reasoning human participant is not called upon for action. These are no less horrifying than the others, but it was clear that to find such a woman, one would have to ply a muckrake among the ranks of the lowest, most abandoned, and depraved members of the prostitute class. One had heard of such things in the brothels of Paris, Berlin, and Naples. I shrank from the bare idea of encountering such creatures. I had experimented successfully in artificial fecundation with the lower animals, but when I considered the possibility of carrying this higher, I found myself confronted with the same insuperable feeling of horror and repulsion. But, nonetheless, theoretically, the thing became an idée fixe in my mind, an ultima ratio probably never destined to get beyond the theoretical stage. This brings me down to a moment, now 14 years ago, which in the success of achievement has cast a shadow over the whole of my remaining life. I had read so far in Barodel's manuscript, and at this point I sprang to my feet, overcome with a hideous nausea. I felt that I was fainting from sheer terror and apprehension. What was I going to read? I put down the manuscript, took a stiff dose of brandy, and walked out into the night air to think, to recover my senses, to overcome the horror that was gripping me. I had almost determined to read no further when a fearful thought crossed my mind. It will probably have crossed the reader's. I tried to put it from me in vain. It simply tortured me physically, but I knew I must read on. After an hour I returned home. I crept up to our bedroom. Unica was sleeping peacefully, her delicious smile just parting her perfect lips. I reassured myself for a moment, and then fell back again into my previous mood of terror and consternation. Whatever I was to read, I brought it upon myself. and I went back to the damned manuscript. The manuscript continued. I used to get the animals which served me for my research work down in the docks from the successors of the renowned Jamrock. They thought, and I did not undeceive them, that I was an agent of the Zoological Society. One day I visited my purveyor in answer to a note informing me that he had a remarkable, splendid specimen of Felis jubata, the Indian hunting leopard or cheetah, an animal I had long desired to possess on account of its curious capacity for being domesticated and kept as a pet. It was a most beautiful beast, a male about a year old which had been bred in captivity and was already as docile and as responsive to caress as any ordinary cat. I bought him and made arrangements for his transfer to my house in the country, where I kept my creatures. The few colleagues who were admitted to a knowledge of my experiments called it my Island of Dr. Moreau, from the late H.G. Wells' dreadful book of that title. Not, however, that my work had anything even remotely in connection with the horrors suggested in that remarkable work. By the use of general and local anesthetics, my animals were never alarmed, or indeed conscious that they were what the anti-vivisectionists would call my martyrs to science. They were a very happy family, and, in point of fact, when they had spent their allotted time with me and had bred the desired hybrid, or failed to do so, in ease and comfort, I transferred them to Regent's Park. No animal ever died under my care or treatment, excepting from pneumonia or some disease incidental to our climate or to the artificial conditions of its existence. I was returning in the late afternoon up Ratcliffe Highway, speculating upon the motley crowd of seafaring folk of all nations that throng that historic thoroughfare, and the degraded types of harlot who ply their wretched trade among them, when one of these, giving my arm a gentle nip as she passed me, said in a half-whisper, "Do you want a naughty girl?" I looked at her as I shrugged her off. She was a finely made, bold-looking strumpet, younger in years, and it seemed to me of a higher racial type than the generality of the local consorority. Very fair, neatly though shabbily dressed, with large, wistful gray eyes and teeth that were both clean and regular. Her appearance surprised me. My short scrutiny encouraged her, and she said rapidly, "I'm the naughtiest girl in the highway, and I like old gentlemen. I'll do anything, show you anything you like. Don't you want to come with me? I'll astonish you." "Go to the devil," I said brutally, "or I'll give you in charge." "All right, governor," she replied. "I'm going. Au revoir, mon ami." And before I could recover from my surprise at her accent, which was perfect, she flung herself on the rails in front of a rapidly approaching tramcar. Deeply shocked and responding to an irresistible instinct, I flung myself after her, caught her by one ankle, and jerked her free of the lines. The driver had applied his brakes, but the front wheels crushed her hat. It was the nearest thing possible. I hauled her onto the pavement, and immediately a dense crowd of loafers, seafarers, and streetwalkers collected round us. She had fainted. "Give us a little room," I said. "I am a doctor. Does anybody know anything about her?" "Know anything?" ejaculated a sailor. "Yes, we all know all there is to know, and that's too much. The dirty bitch." "Oh, law!" chimed in a loathsome and pustular female who had forced her way to the center of the crowd. "The gent's in luck, ain't he? He's got menagerie Sal." "Whatever she is," I replied hotly, "she can't be left here. Where does she live?" "Anywhere you like to take her," said another brute. "Here, get up, Sal," and he kicked her in the side. I sprang up and would have collared the beast, but, perhaps fortunately, the invariable and imperturbable policeman appeared among us, and the crowd fell back. What is she?" I asked the man in blue. "Oh, one of the worst, sir. About the worst, I reckon." The woman was coming round. "Here, get up, Sal," continued the constable, "and go home, if you've got one, or I'll take you." "I am a doctor," I said quickly, and gave him my card. "Whatever she is, I can't leave her alone in this state. Help me to take her in here." There was an eating house just where this occurrence had taken place, and, aided by the constable, I got the woman inside and sat her down in a corner box. The crowd dispersed. As they did so, a draggled harlot called out, "The old gent's in for it, all right. Good luck to him." And the strange sobriquet was bandied from foul mouth to foul mouth. "Menagerie Sal, Menagerie Sal." I sent for some brandy and sat, looking at her as she gradually recovered her self-possession without saying a word. At last, she gave utterance to a short, hoarse laugh and said,
"What
the hell did you do that for? You told me to go there, and I tried to.
Thanks.
You don't want me. What did you stop me for?"
"True," I said, I don't want you. But I couldn't let you kill yourself before my eyes. I'm a man, not a brute.
All men are brutes,
she said defiantly. There was a most extraordinary struggle of accents in her speak. She spoke the low Cockney vernacular with fluency and emphasis, but occasional words, intonations, seemed to jar against the vulgarity of the rest of it. Not at all, I replied. Myself, for instance. Now look here. I'll turn your own question on you. What did you do it for?
What's that to you?
It's a good deal. You're too young and healthy to want to die, however beastly your life may be. Whilst there's life, there's hope. You are worth saving.
Saving? My God, let me up and out of this. You're a bloody gospeler. That's what you are. You're going to talk about the temple of my body, and God and that. I ain't a temple. It's a cesspool, and there ain't no God. Let me go.
I am not a gospeler, and I don't want to preach to you. But I am a doctor, and I want to know what it all means.
King of the Hill.
It means that I'm down and out. I've stuck it long enough. You heard what they called me. Menagerie Sal.
She pronounced menagerie perfectly.
I'm too low and down for any self-respecting whore to speak to. I can't get a lodging except in Chink's Dive, and I can't get a man unless he's a stranger in these parts. That's why I clawed you. Or right down the utter beast of a heathen.
You're in a wildly hysterical state, that's evident. Now look here. I've saved your life, and you belong to me until I've done with you. The wretched creature turned on a professional smile. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not going to have you, but I'm going to make you eat something. Hungry?
I don't know. I ought to be. I know I've been empty as a drum for 2 days. I wonder what you're getting at.
Nothing in particular, I replied. But you are going to have some food. We can't sit here and do nothing for the good of the house. I ordered some food, which arrived coarse but plain and good, and she ate sparingly, and with a strange refinement contrasting remarkably with her vocabulary. When she would eat no more, I lit a pipe and gave her a cigarette. She had calmed down. Now look here, I said again. Do you feel anything like gratitude to me for what I've done?
No, I don't, she replied. But that doesn't matter. There are other ways. I'll do it when there's no interfering toff around.
No, you won't. You are going to promise me not to do it again. She looked me straight in the face without speaking, her chin resting on her hand, puffing cigarette smoke quietly so as not to reach me. At last I said, well? She replied,
Shut up, I'm thinking.
A penny for your thoughts.
I'll take the penny. I want one. You couldn't make it a shilling, I suppose.
I laid a sovereign on the table. Will that help you out a bit? I asked.
Haven't seen one for years. Car governor.
And she deftly slipped a coin into her stocking and resumed her scrutiny of my face. You haven't told me your thoughts, and I've paid, I suggested. And then I experienced the shock which Balaam must have felt when his ass addressed him. She took her cigarette from her lips and said quite slowly and without a trace of Cockney accent,
You look like an intelligent man. I should say a scientist of sorts. Not many doctors or scientists down this way. How can you be such an idiot as to ask me to promise you not to do it again? Do you remember what that girl Wade in Little Dorrit said to the champion, asked Clinham?
By the way, I've often wondered if Dickens knew he was describing a lesbian.
You know, about people who are all the time coming to meet us from strange places along strange roads, and what they'll do to us, and we to them will all be done. Whether I do it again or not has nothing to do with me. It depends at the moment upon you, or rather, upon the puny little part you happen to be playing in the inexorable progress of inevitable consequences.
I was dumbfounded. It was my turn to sit and gaze at her.
This way and that, dividing the swift mind.
And she, taking up my case from the table where I had laid it, took a new cigarette, lit it, said thank you, and resumed her position, her chin on her hands looking at me. At last I said, How in God's name have you come to this? You are too good.
Don't say that. That's what these missions to fallen women begin with. And don't bring in God, unless you feel the need of him for conversational emphasis or convenience, like Xerxes at the end of a rhyming alphabet.
Let's put it on the lowest grounds, then. You are a woman of some education, evidently, and permit me to say, of some refinement. You are too good for Ratcliffe Highway. If prostitution is your vocation in life, why not practice in the West End? Why not the Empire or the Alhambra? The promenades at these places had not been closed in those days.
Never mind when or where I started. I It's none of your business. I came to grief on a P&O steamer. I'd had lots of men, some of the best, but coming home once from China, I fell madly in love with Alaska. A common ship's hand, a bronze god. I wanted him, and I seduced him. It didn't take much doing. I had money then, but I was ashamed. I was capable of it then, to take him up west. I joined him down here. I used to go up west myself sometimes. No one here knew it, when I was just longing for love. Real love. A woman.
A woman?
Yes. Or a real lover, or mistress. Well, don't look shocked. If you're a doctor, you know women can love a woman better than anyone on earth.
Then, among other things, you are a...
Lesbian. Don't be afraid to say it.
But I don't understand how you...
It's easy. Men don't do it for brothels where women can have anything they want and can pay for. From a vicious flapper of 15 to an insatiable Messalina of 50. The only difference between those and the others is that all the staff are amateurs. Some shop girls and clerks, but mostly gentlewomen. You've never heard of number 100 Canterbury Square, have you? No, kept pretty quiet. But I didn't go there. I preferred to find my own romances.
Romances?
Yes, can't you imagine the delight, after the brutes down here, of meeting eyes in an omnibus? Of a thigh pressed against yours? Of a foot that touches yours as if by accident? Of seeing a pretty shop girl go scarlet when you squeeze her hand as she hands you a parcel? A few ordinary words, a suggestion of meeting again, and then tea together somewhere, and later dinner and a night spent in love that leaves you shattered and sleepy and dreaming for days.
Nearing victory.
It seems horrible to me.
That's because you are a man and don't know what love, really exquisite love, means. Very few men do. But when they do, they're divine.
Victory.
But did you not horrify them at first?
Never. We know one another in a flash. The most wonderful love I ever had was a girl of 19, the daughter of a peer. Oh, she had been to a good school, a finishing school. It finished her, I can tell you. I got to know her people. Oh, yes, I can be a gentlewoman when I like. And I took her away into the country for a week. I bet you she remembers it as I do. And then, back to my brute. He'd have been after me otherwise. He thought I'd gone to get more money. And then there would have been hell and blackmail. So long as my money lasted, we lived in a fairly decent set of rooms, and we had a wonderful time, but, my God, he was a brute. He thrashed me sometimes. I loved it. And vicious. I don't want to make your hair stand on end. I'd read a lot of filthy books here and abroad, and I thought I knew what vice was. The things he did to me, and that he made me do. I tell you, the 5 cities of the plain rolled into one were a Trappist monastery compared to our flat. And his friends that he brought to me, and their animals. You people west of Chancery Lane can't dream what are the vices among the Lascars, Chinamen, Malays, half-breeds, Spanish-Americans, niggers, mulattoes of all kinds. One didn't know at the end of an orgy whether one was a...
We should have like 45 minutes left, so I'll go ahead and start a new video. That one's pretty good. An hour into that. I'm pretty much done with Halo. That was a good last game, but I'm not where I should be, and I'm not progressing.